So we're going to finish where we started with a few more off that list of things reasonable. So here we go. Let's see how many of these you get. Why is the word abbreviation not shorter? It's a fair point, isn't it? It's a fair point. Does pushing the lift button more than once make it arrive faster? Yes, by the way, just so you know. Why do we press harder on a remote control when we know the batteries are flat? Anybody do that? Yes. Do you pull them out and give them the magic rub as well? And it always works. It always works. Seem to have thrown something onto the floor on every session, don't I? So there you go. Consistency. And here's one that'll upset some of you. Why do banks charge a fee on insufficient funds when they know there's not enough money in there to cover it? Yes. A lot of passion with that one, isn't there? That feels quite now and raw, that one, doesn't it? So there are some things that are reasonable, and there are some things that are not reasonable. And today, we're asking the question, is it reasonable, or this session rather, is it reasonable to believe that Christianity is right? And it's kind of asked with a... it's almost like a rhetorical question with an implied negative answer, isn't it? It's like, you know, of course, it's not reasonable to believe that. But I often say, why? Because if we are supposed to live in a postmodern world where everybody's opinion's valid, and I am supposed to be able to do what feels right, why am I not allowed to believe that this is right? Why is that not valid? I've often talked to people and they've said to me, well, all the faiths are basically the same. And I said, actually, all the faiths are basically not the same. Because some of the external issues that they see as like really important issues, like loving your neighbour, of course, those are really, really important. But fundamentally, actually, all the religions in the world pretty well believe the opposite of each other. The only kind of commonality is people believe, and other faiths and other religions believe, that Jesus wasn't Christ. Jesus wasn't God. That's the only commonality often. In a lot of these things, what they believe he was, they would vary, of course, with. I often said to somebody, I said, actually, it's not possible for everybody to be right. It is possible for everybody to be wrong, like academically, but it's not possible for everybody to right, because we are diametrically opposed in what we believe about really, really critical things. I often say to people, for me, it's not that Christianity is right because it's Christianity. Christianity is not right because I'm a Christian. Christianity is right because Jesus was right. And the Christianity is the only religion / faith / whatever you want to call it that actually represents, believes, and teaches what Jesus said. It was Jesus that was right. And I find often by kind of connecting in this way with people from other faiths, it helps me to appreciate their own faith and respect them, but say, look, let's get to Jesus. Let's have a little look at him and find out really whether what he said was true. And that for me is really critical and really, really important. So to help us on that, we're going to have a little look at the life of Jesus. Because I think dealing with this subject, is it reasonable to believe that Christianity is right? I think the critical thing is Jesus. And when we look at what Jesus said and how Christianity celebrates and seek to bring some understanding to that, I think actually that's a great way to present. So first of all, let's consider his birth. Do you remember the millennium bug? Who remembers the year 2000? It's frighteningly quite a long time ago now, isn't it? I still think it's like a couple of years ago. But it wasn't. It was 17 years ago. That we don't want to be thinking about that, do we? Because, you know, 2017 means 17 years since 2000. You don't know that, don't you? I know we basically chose to ignore that fact. Okay, but do you remember there was this great hype? It was, like, I remember watching all the papers, like the party of all parties, wasn't it? It's like, tonight's the night, the party of all parties. And then I read, like, in the newspapers that it was the biggest flop of all time. It's like, do you remember, we didn't quite know what was going to happen with computers. Like, who was a little bit disappointed that nothing kicked off? Yeah? My expectation of things exploding and falling out of everything, it's like, didn't get met, and I was a bit disappointed. I wasn't, by the way. But it was like, it was a marker, wasn't it? 2,000 years. Yeah, 2 millennia have passed. Since what? Jesus. Since Jesus rocked up onto planet Earth, since he turned up into our world, 2,000 years approximately had passed since then. I say to my non-Christian friends, I hope you thanked him for that millennium party. Because Jesus turned up onto this planet. But you know what? For me, the significance of Jesus' arrival on planet Earth wasn't the division of time, but it was the uniting of God in heaven and people on the earth. And actually, if we only view it as a moment in time where we put a slice through time, but actually even that was significant. Such was the significance of this birth, this person called Jesus, that we decided to make everything that happened before it, BC, before Christ, and everything that happened since it, Anno Domini, AD, in the year of our Lord. Such was the arrival, this birth, that it put that slice right through time. When I was born, I don't think it had quite an impact like that. Although I do remember my mum saying to my dad, do you remember what life was like before, Mark? So I don't know whether that was quite the same. But this arrival of Jesus was so significant. And I think we need to understand Jesus definitely existed. He definitely existed. The great Jewish historian Josephus, the Mishnah, which is the Jewish teachings, the Roman historian Tacitus, Pliny, who was a Roman writer, Suetonius, many other of these historians all agree about the main facts of the existence of Jesus. In fact, it's totally true to say that no serious historian would deny the existence of Jesus. Proof of his existence isn't the critical thing in dealing with Jesus. It's proof of his identity that is the critical thing. Of course, there are some difficulties that people would have with the birth of Christ. Reference the virgin birth, which I mentioned a few hours ago. I can't remember which session now because it's all blurred into one, but that actually just sufficient to say, or suffice it to say, if we have no problem accepting evolution, we shouldn't really have a problem accepting the virgin birth because it was easier. It was much more straightforward that something came from something rather than something coming from nothing, just to remind and reiterate that. But that clearly is a difficulty that some people have when I've had conversations with them. It's interesting that well over 300 prophecies, predictions were made about Jesus, and they were all fulfilled. I mean, it's pretty staggering. If you break down the sums on that, and you've already heard me explain that sums are not my strong point, but suffice it to say, it doesn't happen a lot. The chances of all of these prophecies and all of these predictions being fulfilled, and yet they were, it's absolutely staggering. So his birth is pretty critical, but I think it's not the critical thing. I think that we need to be having a little look at the life of Jesus. Read this great story. It says there was a man who worked hard all his life. Apparently this is a true story. He'd saved all his money, and he was known as a miser, somebody who didn't like to spend his money. And just before he died, he said to his wife, when I die, I want you to take all my money and put it in the coffin with me. And so he got his wife to promise it, to promise that when I die, take all my money and put it into the coffin with me. So she promised that. Well, eventually he died, and he was stretched out in a coffin, and it was at the funeral, and his wife was there next to her friend for support. She was dressed in black with a friend next to her. And when the ceremony finished, just before the undertakers took the coffin away, she said, just wait a minute. And she took a small metal box with her, and she put this small metal box into the coffin with the man. And then she said, right, you can take it away. And her friend said to her, what were you thinking of? I know you weren't fool enough to put all that money in the box with him. And she said, do you know what? I'm a Christian. I said to my husband, I'll put it all in there. You can take it with him. I promised that, and that's what I've done. I'm a loyal wife. And her friend said, what, you've actually taken all of the money? Yeah. I put it in my bank account. I wrote him a check. And if he can spend it, he can have it. I don't like the way some of you women were making notes about that one. It's only slightly concerning, only slightly. So this guy, what they did is they looked at his life and identified what he was like in his life, and then labeled him thus. In other words, he was a miser when he lived and a miser when he died, and that's what we remember him to be. In one of the sessions earlier, I just hinted at this. I think it's incumbent upon us as Christians to let people know what Jesus was like in his life. Because most people are making a decision about what Jesus was like just on his death, and at best on his birth, and occasionally on his resurrection. But we never even introduce people to the life of Jesus, and I think it's so critical. I would argue that if the life of Jesus wasn't speaking volumes, I think he might have died sooner. Why did God leave him around? Listen, anybody understand God? I don't. But I can understand Jesus to a degree or more. And I think looking at the life of Jesus, it gives me a window into what God's like. And so I actually think by letting people meet Jesus and look really into his life, it gives them a bit of a window into what God is like. And I think that's really, really important. Madonna said, when I was growing up, I was religious in a passionate way. Jesus Christ was like a movie star, my favorite idol of all. As John Lennon of the Beatles said, we're more popular than Jesus. Not entirely sure, if I'm honest. And Jesus was interested, wasn't he, as to what people thought about him. You get that great passage, one version of it in Mark, and it appears in a few other Gospels, where Jesus is out and about, and he says to Simon Peter, mentioned it again briefly this morning, just a reminder because it's appropriate for this part of the presentation that I share it. He said, who are people saying I am? And there's lots of people have got their opinions, haven't they? And I often say to people, who do you think Jesus was? When I'm involved in conversation with them. And often this subject matter is quite a long way on the journey. We position this in the Reason to Believe course as the last one, because on the last evening, that's when we go for an evangelistic call. And you can only really do that off the back of talking about Jesus, to be honest with you. So I position this quite a long way in the journey, but I want to get people looking at the life of Jesus and challenge them and said, look, you can't make a decision about who Jesus is without actually looking. It goes back to this thing again, tasting and see, the banoffee pie, the curry. And I've run out of illustrations on that one. But it's that idea that please, look, now listen, I am gutted if people don't want to know Christ. Of course I am. But at least if they've looked into it and then decided, then I think that's a better place to be. It breaks my heart if anybody doesn't want to know Christ. But Jesus said, who's everybody saying? All right, and then he said to Simon Peter, who do you say? And I think it's really important, just when we ask conversation to people, who have you heard people say that Jesus is? Who do you think he is? Who do you think he is? And have a discussion on that basis. C.S. Lewis, who's a bit of a genius, really, is this great intellectual who's wrote these fantastically academic books, but then writes these brilliant books, The Chronicles of Narnia, that children have enjoyed for many, many years. It's a great skill. C.S. Lewis said this. He was a professor at Cambridge, and actually I do think he spent a little bit of time at Oxford as well. And he's once an agnostic being somebody who sometimes believes there is a God and sometimes believes there isn't. And there are certain things that make them kind of fall more closely to believing in God, but other times things that make kind of pull them away a little bit. And he said these words, a man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. Now he said that, if you look, and certainly if you look at Faith Book, the little booklet, Sharing Your Faith with Other Faiths, we look into what all the other kind of the key religions and cults say about Jesus. Many of them, well all of them, but I think all of them barring one who just believed that he was a spirit man, most of them recognize that he was somebody special, but don't feel they can deify him or call him God. But neither do they feel that they should just, say he was a rather nice man. You know, so what they do as a kind of respectful compromise is they'll say things like, well, he was a great moral teacher. A great moral teacher. And it's lovely that they want to respect him, but unfortunately, saying he was a great moral teacher actually doesn't work. And this is what Lewis is saying. Let me finish the quotation, then I'll explain to you. Lewis goes on to say he would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who claimed to be a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. He adds, you can shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up rather with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great moral teacher. Now, as rants go, that's a good one, isn't it? You know, like Lewis is ranting on there. He's a little bit brutal, isn't he? And I'm thinking, like, I listen and go, Lewis, you need to chill out a little bit. Do you know what I mean? You've gone a little bit over. Why is Lewis so strong on this? Why is he so like, this is the deal, this is the story? Why is he saying we don't have the luxury of calling him a great moral teacher? Well, it's because Lewis looked at his life. He looked at the life of the man. And when you look at the life of the man called Jesus, both in the scriptures, but actually externally as well, so other writings by historians, ones who didn't have a particular kind of view of Jesus being the Christ either, so they're not coming with that bias. They say some pretty remarkable things about him, which we'll analyze in a few moments' time. But coming back to what Lewis said, he said, look, we basically got a few options. And the options are, and the best way for me to follow these through with you is to show you the kind of options on the screen. Now, you need to know, we haven't got time to go into it today, but you need to know implicitly and explicitly the Bible and Jesus claim that Jesus is God, and even God calls Jesus God when you dig around and do some study, as well as some more obvious things. For example, in John 10, I believe, verse 33, when they're just about to stone Jesus, they say to him, oh, by the way, we're not stoning you because of the miracles you do. We're stoning you because you and me, a man, claim to be God. I don't know whether Jesus is supposed to feel better that they're not stoning him for you know, that, oh, right, okay, if it's only about the miracles, you know, it's like, oh, thank you very much, stone me then. Do you know, I think, like, I don't know why they put it that way, but clearly in this monotheistic, mono-believing a belief in one God, in this Jewish monotheistic culture where they believed in an absolute God, they were in no uncertain terms aware that Jesus was claiming to be God. And that's one of many, many references. So Jesus made some pretty seismic claims. He claimed to be God. He claimed to be able to forgive people of their wrong. He claimed to be able to give them a secure, eternal future. He claimed that he was worth trusting with your eternity. They are seismic claims. Would we agree on that? Like they are pretty major. As claims go, they are pretty major. Now, we live in an interesting world where we talk about truth. We've been chatting over lunch about some of the kind of the next stages of truth and how the world views it. A friend of mine said to me once, he said, the problem is I don't believe in right or wrong. A little bit like what we chatted about. I said, I know you believe in right or wrong. He said, why do that? I said, we went to a quiz and you put an answer down which you thought was right. And the quiz master said it was wrong and you were furious. And he was completely furious. It's weird, isn't it, how we say we don't believe in right or wrong until somebody wrongs us. And all of a sudden, very clearly, there's something is wrong. So I think often this thing is, I think it's a searching for truth rather than a decision about truth necessarily. Jesus made these claims. Now, I'm a pretty logical person. And you need to understand with this, it's all done within the context of looking at the life of Jesus. Okay, when I'm sat down and I'm progressing on the journey with people, and I take them through Jesus' life and introduce them to Jesus and show them things about him and kind of get them a bit more familiar with him. I'll give them a copy of one of the Gospels, Mark, because it's a shorter one. It's an easy one. It's a pacey one. Uses the word immediately or a simile 22 times in 16 chapters. It's a pretty pacey gospel. So it's a good one to give to people. And I engage people with that. Get them looking at some of the claims that Jesus made. And then we talk about the claims that Jesus made. And I say to him, Jesus made these claims. Now, either they were true or not true. Now, for me, that's pretty simple. And remember, this is done in conversation with people. Let's assume that Jesus made these claims and they weren't true. Let's put true to one side. They could be true and he knew it. Okay? True and he knew it. Now, remember, we're using this within the context of Jesus being a great moral teacher. Okay? That's the backdrop. People have relegated him to that, but they feel that they're paying him a little bit of service and credibility. So if Jesus made these claims to be God, to forgive people, to be able to heal people, etc., he made these claims, they weren't true, and he knew it, he can't be a great moral teacher because he's lying. As my mother used to say, through the back teeth. I don't know how you lie through your back teeth, but apparently you can. And so Jesus is making these seismic claims they weren't true, and he knew it. So he's just basically telling a pack of lies. In fact, this is probably one of the greatest con acts ever to hit our planet. So we can't say Jesus was a great moral teacher, because he was immoral if indeed he made these claims and they weren't true and he knew it. But maybe he made these claims and they weren't true, but he didn't know it. Does that make sense? So he made the claims, not true, but he didn't know it. And we still can't call him a great moral teacher because he was deluded. He was deceived. He lived his life as something he wasn't, but he didn't even know it. Now, here's the critical thing. This is why you've got to do these things within the context of introducing people to Jesus. You can't really use these in isolation, this argument. You have to do it with engagement in getting people to really look at the life of Jesus, both from the scriptures and actually external too. Because maybe Jesus made these claims and they were true, which is exactly why he made them. So you look at this and then you analyze the life of Jesus with this. So for example, Josephus, the great Jewish historian who wrote about the history of the Jewish nation in AD 90, tells us this. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. That nails it right there. A source external to the Bible tells us that he was good. He wasn't deluded. He didn't live a lie. And in fact, it's really, really interesting because when you look at what happened, and in fact, Josephus goes on to talk about this, he says, many people from among the Jews and from other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who'd become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them and that 3 days after his crucifixion, he was alive. And so you read these sources, both from the scriptures and externally, and they all report about these incredible things that Jesus did. They all report about the fact that he had some incredible followers. In fact, such was the influence that Jesus had, is when he got to a town, many times, the gospel tells us, he rocked up to a place and people were already there, waiting for him. And that's without Twitter and Facebook. That's the incredible thing. I mean, like, that's social media on a very different level, isn't it? That news spread like wildfire about Jesus. Why? Because do you know what? Wherever Jesus was, there was an anticipation something was going to happen. That's why we follow him today, isn't it? Because there's an anticipation within us that something can happen. And the Bible talks loads of times that crowds followed him. He healed people. He was faultless. They could find no fault in him. He confounded religious leaders when he was young. We believe he was a rabbi. Thousands flocked to see him. It was said of him that no man spoke like this man. It's actually quite incredible. And that's why I paint this picture for people about the life of Jesus. Introduce them to him and then take them through this framework and get them to analyze off the back of that, well, who is this Jesus? and to kind of present his life to them. I'm from Bradford originally, and before I did this, I was a butcher, okay? And I remember we had this lady called Madame in Bradford, all right? Now, Madame was bonkers. She really, really was. And we loved her in Bradford. She was a character. We really loved her. But what we knew in Bradford is that if you saw Madame, you got on the other side of the street. Honestly, because if you didn't, she would hit you with a walking stick, like really hard. Really hard. Now, in Bradford, we don't like Leeds. And we used to love it when Leeds football fans came to Bradford, because they didn't know about Madame. And our Bradford hooligans didn't need to kick in, because Leeds supporters would get battered by Madame's stick, and we loved it. Give me another one, Madame. I mean, I didn't. I was Christian, loved Jesus. I didn't do that sort of thing. But what I make that point because, like, even though we loved Madame, it's like we stayed well away from her. We didn't throw ourselves at her feet and say, Madame, what pearls of wisdom have you got for helping me to live life? We didn't do any of that because we knew she was a little bit crazy. And when you look at the life of Jesus, she was more than a little bit. When you look at the life of Jesus, you have to be honest and say, he wasn't crazy. Crowds flocked to see him. This wasn't a lie he was propagating. He spoke many times about his integrity and the fact he was virtuous. And actually, when you actually proper look at the life of Jesus, you don't have the luxury of concluding he was just a good moral teacher. You don't have the luxury of concluding that by looking at his life. You don't have the luxury of concluding that by analysing the lack of logic or the logic. And that's why Lewis got a little bit kind of ranty when he was saying to that. He's basically saying, look, you cannot relegate Jesus. When you look at his life and you analyse it, you cannot relegate him to just a good moral teacher. See, Jesus didn't just tell the truth. He was the truth. Clues in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. In fact, Rousseau, who was a French opponent of Christianity, said, if the life and death of Socrates are those of a philosopher, the life and death of Jesus are those of God, which I think is quite a poignant phrase. And that's why Jesus said to him, look, who do people say I am? But most importantly, who do you say I am? So I would encourage you with this session, think about, is it reasonable to believe that Christianity is right? First of all, have a little look. Probably start with the life of Jesus, but be aware there might be some things to do with the birth of Jesus. But then we should take people, of course, to the death of Jesus, because that's like pretty critical. And so how do you explain the death of Jesus to people? So I want you to imagine this, because the death of Jesus really happened. Tacitus, the great Roman historian who wrote in AD 15 concerning the great fire of Rome and how the Emperor Nero attempted to fasten the blame onto Christians. He said this, Christus, Christ, from whom they take their name, had been executed by sentence of the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate when Tiberius was governor. So, externally again, they record about the death of Jesus. It's interesting. Socrates, the Greek philosopher, said if a perfect man came to this world, everyone would gang up on him and kill him. He said this about 400 years before Christ. How poignant is that? He who knew no sin became sin for us. The perfect one, they ganged up on him and killed him. But how can we help people to consider about the importance and the uniqueness of the death of Christ? Well, this is the way that I do. I want you to imagine on your way home tonight, you're driving home or walking home, whichever particular way you're going to go home. I guess tubing it home in London, isn't it, really? And I want you to imagine you get off the tube or out of your car or whatever, and you're walking towards your house. Does everybody know what a sinkhole is? Yeah. For those of you who maybe not quite sure, a sinkhole is when suddenly the ground gives way underneath the surface. And this can have been happening for many, many years. And all of a sudden, underneath it just drops out. And then the road or the path, houses even, have fallen into these sinkholes, whole cars, and people have died. I want you to imagine on your way home today, you fall into a sinkhole. Just to cheer you up. It's an illustration, chill out, or it's not going to happen. So you're on your way home, and you fall down this sinkhole, and you realise you're in a bit of a mess. You know you're not going to last very long. And you've broken your legs and arms, just to depress you even more. And you burst some water mains and, the water's rising. And you've worked it out. You probably got about half an hour at best before you die. Okay? Anybody feeling happy right now? Nobody. You want to go back to the perfect wives thingy, don't you, from... So imagine that that's the situation, all right? There you are in this sinkhole, and you're looking up and you're shouting, help, help. And somebody comes across the top and looks over it and goes, are you all right? Because that's what we do, isn't it? The first thing we do when we know somebody's in a right mess, are you all right, love? No, I need your help. All right. See you later. But so you just imagine you're in this sinkhole, help, help, and space comes across the top. Are you all right? No. Broke me arms. Well, I don't know if you can do that if you broke your arms, but you know what I mean. Broke me arms, broke my legs. Look, water level, not me that long. Right, okay. Ooh, you are in a mess, aren't you? Right, then, this is probably what you need to do. Put yourself together. Yeah, that's good. Maybe pull yourself up. Maybe climb. You see that ledge there? Can you get onto that ledge? If you can get onto that ledge and then climb up and do this and do that. Oh, no, don't do that. Then if you do this and just do your best, really. Do your best to get yourself out of the sinkhole, and that may or may not be sufficient. Question, is that the kind of help you want? Some of you are not sure. Let me help you, it's not. Okay, so they walk off, leave you down the hall. You resort back to help, help, help. Time is ebbing away, the waters are filling, the pain is increasing. A little head comes over the top and goes, you all right? No, I'm not all right. Legs broken, arms broken, water rising. I reckon I've only got another 15 minutes now. Right. You're in a mess, aren't you? Yeah. But are you in a mess? And inside you're thinking, yeah. They know you're not really a mess. It's not real. Mess is not real. Or at best, enter into a state of inner peace. And thereby removing yourself from the reality of the mess. All right? Thank you. Goodbye. Glad to have been of some help. They walk on. You're sat here, you can't pull yourself together, you can't do enough to get yourself out of a mess, you can't escape it because the pain's a constant reminder, you can do nothing to sort yourself out in the mess. So you revert back to shouting. By this time you've got about 10 minutes. Help! Help! A little face comes over the top and says, you all right? And you think, if somebody else asks me, I'm not, no, legs, arms broken, probably only got 10 minutes now. Right, don't worry, I'm coming to get you. They find a conveniently located piece of rope. They wrap it around a conveniently placed tree and wrap it around themselves. They come down and look at you and say, you're not going to be able to get out of this on yourself. Let me get you out. They pick you up because they've come down to your mess, down to the hole, down to the danger, not telling you that it's all down to you or that you can avoid it or escape it or get away from it. They pick you up and take you out of the mess and get you sorted and fixed up. Question, is that the type of help that you want? Yes. Some of you are still not sure. It is. It is the type of help. Okay, I've analysed most of, pretty well, the key religions, cults and philosophies in the world, and they basically fall into one or two categories. Number one, it's all about your effort, and even then you're not guaranteed freedom at the end. Or that you ignore it, you escape from it, it's not real. Either because it's some ethereal thing or you can escape from it. The truth is neither of those actually get you out of the mess that you're in. What you need is somebody that comes down and rescues you. And when I'm trying to talk about the uniqueness and the significance of Jesus, this is the picture that I use, that Jesus was God's rescue plan. That he came down from heaven. God doesn't say to us, do this, do that, do the other, and you may or may not get out. He doesn't tell you to escape from it or ignore it or live at peace inside. He says, look, there's absolutely nothing you can do to be free of this stuff, and so I'm going to come and do everything that's necessary. And I talk about Jesus being God's rescue man, this perfect man of whom Socrates said, the quote that I mentioned just a few moments ago, that he was God's rescue plan. And this is the point where I begin to do much more of the kind of gospel stuff when we're focusing it around Jesus. So his death, his birth, his life, his death, and then finally his resurrection. Now, I always struggle with the resurrection. I don't struggle with the resurrection. I always struggle to explain the resurrection because in truth, talking through the resurrection would be a whole 50-minute session in itself. So one of the things I want to do is, first of all, recommend a book to you. And secondly, let me tell you how I begin to deal with the resurrection. What's really fascinating recently is some friends of mine conducted something called the Talking Jesus Survey. And it's a fascinating read. You can download it from the Evangelical Alliance website and Talking Jesus, I think it's .com. But if you put Talking Jesus Research, it'll come up. It's a downloadable PDF. And it employed the services of some secular survey people. And they're standard criteria that are employed. So, for example, 1,000 people are surveyed across a broad spectrum. And that's deemed to be the analysis that gives you a pretty good picture of the state of the UK. Okay, so that's standard research criteria. That's what they adopt. And Talking Jesus presentation was the outcome of this survey, and it was quite fascinating, actually. There were a few of us in the evangelist world that were a little bit shocked and surprised in a good way about the outcome. And by and large, people had a fairly positive view about Christians. I mean, it would have been interesting if it had been positioned as the church, or whether they would have seen that differently. But most people said they knew a Christian and had a fairly positive experience, which I thought was really positive. And many of them talked about not having a problem with the resurrection, which is really, really interesting. So I think there's something in us, we should still do an apologetic on the resurrection of Christ, but actually let's show why Jesus Christ came back alive. You see, he died so we could be forgiven, but he came back alive so we could live. And I think we need to talk about the resurrection a little bit more. But just to help us, the book I want to recommend to you is Who Moved the Stone by a man called Frank Morrison. And I use this as if I haven't got a lot of time to go into the resurrection, I use this as a kind of an example, and that's what we're going to do today. And I'll just very quickly touch on some of the stuff Morrison talked about. But suffice it to say, Frank Morrison set out to write a book to disprove the resurrection. He was a bit annoyed about these Christians claiming the resurrection was real and was true. And he set out to write a book. And he did that. He decided he was going to examine the evidence meticulously, really look into it. It was a gift that he had, and he would really look into it, and he'd present the evidence, collate it all, and present it into this book to finally disprove the resurrection. So understand, his premise was the resurrection wasn't true, and he set out to prove that that was the case. So often people look at evidence then to support their premise, right? But in doing so, he couldn't find any evidence that supported his premise. And he concluded that the resurrection did happen, and he did write a book called Who Moved the Stone, which is a great chapter, a great book name. The first chapter is called The Book That Refused to Be Written. And in it, he gives his testimony about how he came to faith. And he shares his story. And then the book then relays and presents the evidence. And he analysed whether it was a fraud, whether the body was stolen by the authorities or by the disciples. He analysed, did Jesus just faint and revive in the cool of the tomb? Was it Jesus on there? He analysed whether it was a delusion, just a mass hallucination. And he did a lot of thorough research. And at the end of that, he concluded, no, it was a miracle. Jesus really did rise again from the dead. And in fact, even Josephus alludes to this. Pilate condemned him, Jesus, Josephus says, to be crucified and to die. And those who became his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them and that 3 days after his crucifixion, he was alive. The Lord Chief Justice, former Lord Chief Justice of England, Lord Taylor, said no sane jury looking at the evidence for the resurrection would fail to bring in a verdict other than it actually happened. These are people who are used to looking at evidence and presenting what the evidence suggests. And I haven't got time. It's tempting to go and look at those individual components of the fraud and such like. And I do that if I have longer with people to sit down when considering the life of Jesus. But to save time today, I would just encourage you to buy the book, Who Moved the Stone? We're drawing to an end of this session. I think when you look at the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ, you realize that it is reasonable to believe. And it's good to preach this, but it's better to have a discussion and a conversation with people, because if Christ be not risen from the dead, your faith is in vain. And actually, for me, the validity of the Christian faith rises on the resurrection. And if the resurrection happened, then Jesus was who he said he was. And if he was who he said he was, then his death makes sense. And you begin to realize that actually him coming into planet Earth was so significant. Jesus himself said, because I live, you also can live. And I think when you look at the life of Jesus and properly rather get to grips with it, you realize that this guy wasn't just a good moral teacher, but he was who he said he was. Let me just finish with a quick little illustration. I mentioned big yes, little yes, healthy maybe on the screen. I'm not going to write anything else on there. But with all of the apologetic stuff, what it does, it engages people in their mind. It engages people in their brain. And it gives an opportunity for people to process. This is a long process often with apologetics. I think I said briefly on Friday night that people need to go through a lot of these doubts before, so they externalize them before they come to faith these days. And do you know what? I don't think that's as new a thing as we think. I'm always grabbed, and I'll leave you with this verse from Acts 26. Forgive me, I think it's Acts 26. It's where Paul is telling his story to King Agrippa. And he tells his story, and it's a fascinating presentation. It's very reasonable. In fact, the comments made, it's reasonable as he gives this presentation about what's just happened to him. And then right at the end, King Agrippa says, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? Now, one translation says, almost thou persuadest me to become a Christian. But the more accurate translation is, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? And then Paul says, short time or long, I pray that you and all of the people here listening will become Christians, or will become as I am, apart from the chains. He puts that little caveat, and he don't want them in chains. But Paul's committed to a short term or a long term. And I think just as I land my presentation today, you've been amazing, by the way. You've listened so good, and you've interacted, and you've really helped keep it moving along. Thank you. But let me just reiterate one point, and then kind of a reminder. We have to be patient. We have to be sensitive, but we have to enter into these sorts of things and just get ourselves more confident at being able to deal with things that we can help people on the journey. I honestly don't believe, and this is what I wanted to reiterate, As much as I believe in apologetics, first and foremost, I see it in the life of Jesus. Secondly, we're commanded to do it. That's reason enough to do it. But just a reminder that by presenting to somebody brilliant arguments doesn't necessarily mean they're going to believe. Okay? So, and it's not down to us. What is down to us is to present well. What is down to us is to be a good steward of every single conversation we have with a person. And one of the verses that I love when thinking about evangelism is this little verse that we take it slightly the wrong way. It says, make the most of every opportunity. We think that means we have got to batter people with an M16 of the gospel. It's like, oh, there's a glimmer of a conversation. Brace yourself. Do you know what I mean? And that's not what it's about. Making the most of every opportunity could mean that we just spend a little bit of time thinking about the resurrection, or a little bit of time thinking about Jesus, or a little bit of time thinking about suffering. But it's my experience, after 29 years doing evangelism personally, full-time, but longer than that, that actually just an ongoing dialogue and an ongoing conversation is a really, really helpful thing. I was struck again just this past week. I was speaking on what is evangelism, and I talked about it being proclamation, and I mentioned that when Peter stood up amongst the crowd. But then I quoted again Philip the Ethiopian eunuch. And I was grabbed again by that, because he runs up to the chariot and says to him, do you understand what you're reading? What a great way in. And it just reminded me of that person. Let's just be saying to people, do you understand this? Can we dialogue? Can we have conversation about this? And can we journey together? And hopefully through this, people will begin to see that it's reasonable to believe. Amen? Amen.